This is exactly how I would rise from the routine of a 9-to-5 career to establishing a fortune of my own, not only through money, but through control of power itself. Machiavelli once said that fortune is a woman, and if you want to control her, you have to treat her boldly. He was not talking about luck, rather, he meant audacity, the bravery to stop obeying and begin commanding. I understand this because I used to live the obedient life. I earned an average income, obeyed the rules, waited for approval, and sank in silent bitterness. But the moment I stopped waiting for fortune to favor me and determined to take her, everything shifted. If I could go back to that version of myself, stuck behind fluorescent lights and having a decent income, I'd tell him, the first step isn't about quitting your career, it's about changing your mentality. A man's wealth is a reflection of his chosen ability, his weapon in the battlefield of life. Machiavelli said that every prince must have a virtue, the capacity to force his will upon uncertain situations. In today's world, it means establishing your Machiavellian skill, the discipline or technique that gives you leverage over other people. Go to work, yes, but study the work, which increases power. So this is what I would do: open your mind like a strategy. Visit Google, your modern-day Florence Research Center, and type, professions of billionaires. You will see a predictable list: businessmen, investors, legal professionals, engineers, and artists. Now do not skim it, build an outline. Evaluate each one according to your natural interest and current competence. Where your curiosity and capacity overlap, you will discover your first seat of power. When I did this exercise several years ago, I discovered that I didn't have the patience for engineering, the expertise for law, or the desire to obey an employer for long enough to ascend the company ladder. So I switched toward entrepreneurship. It was not because I felt it was appealing, instead, it was because it was the shortest route to sovereignty, like a prince taking a collapsing fortress and deciding to rebuild it in his own image. I needed control, even if it meant risk. But this route involves an even tougher decision: isolation. You see, you can never build an empire surrounded by ordinary people. The second step is brutal: you have to terminate connections with the powerless. Machiavelli said that a ruler's downfall usually starts with poor connections, and I learned this lesson the hard way. When I first told people I wanted to establish my own business, I expected support. What I got was mockery. The people I respected laughed, criticized, and dismissed me, not out of spite, but because my ambition threatened their level of comfort. I remember talking enthusiastically about what I was discovering, the books I was reading, and the nights I spent awake making plans. They would change the topic. They would speak about gossip, shows on television, and any distraction keeping them comfortable. I understood then, my progress made me a stranger in my own circle of friends. It was not personal, it was natural. Evolution rewards people who evolve and punishes people who attach to the familiar. Therefore I withdrew. It was lonely, but that loneliness was the crucible. Anyone who strives for greatness must endure exile before ascending. Napoleon was exiled before becoming emperor again. Machiavelli himself wrote The Prince while exiled from Florence, robbed of power, yet his exile developed concepts that would outlive kings. Your own differentiation from mediocrity is the same test. The weak call it solitude, the strong call it preparation. Here is the reality that nobody tells you: your energy is limited, and your network consumes it. Every interaction that does not align with your future undermines your power over it. The poor will lure you into their sorrow, disguised as reality. The mediocre will criticize your ambition to make their failures feel rational. You must safeguard your mind the way a ruler protects his fortress, every gate locked, every wall manned. When I cut off people who criticized my objectives, I didn't just lose friends, I obtained space, silence, and concentration, an emotional vacuum that I could eventually fill with wisdom, power, and strategy. That is when the true transformation occurred, since once you cut off the noise of the crowd, your own voice gets audible again, and you begin to think not like a worker but like a ruler plotting his first conquest. But here's the difficulty Machiavelli could warn you about: solitude without guidance creates delusion. The moment you have eliminated the weak, you have to replace them with the powerful. The next stage of your rise demands that you enter into proximity with people who are living the life you desire. That is how influence transfers, not through luck, but through imitation of the master. And that takes us to the next move, the strategic replacement of your group with mentors, role models, and billionaires who already have access to the kingdom. Because proximity, as Machiavelli understood, is the shadow of influence, and anyone you stand beside long enough, you will ultimately become. Here is the reality that nobody tells you: your energy is limited, and your network consumes it. Every interaction that does not align with your future undermines your power over it. The poor will lure you into their sorrow, disguised as reality. The mediocre will criticize your ambition to make their failures feel rational. You must safeguard your mind the way a ruler protects his fortress, every gate locked, every wall manned. When I cut off people who criticized my objectives, I didn't just lose friends, I obtained space, silence, and concentration, an emotional vacuum that I could eventually fill with wisdom, power, and strategy. That is when the true transformation occurred, since once you cut off the noise of the crowd, your own voice gets audible again, and you begin to think not like a worker but like a ruler plotting his first conquest. But here's the difficulty Machiavelli could warn you about: solitude without guidance creates delusion. The moment you have eliminated the weak, you have to replace them with the powerful. The next stage of your rise demands that you enter into proximity with people who are living the life you desire. That is how influence transfers, not through luck, but through imitation of the master. And that takes us to your next move, the strategic replacement of your group with mentors, role models, and billionaires who already have access to the kingdom. Because proximity, as Machiavelli understood, is the shadow of influence, and anyone you stand beside long enough, you will ultimately become. Once you have silenced the noise of mediocrity, you have to fill that gap with wisdom, ambition, and example. Machiavelli observed that men usually follow the beaten route, and yet by imitation, they accomplish what other people before them have accomplished. The current version of that reality is simple: your proximity determines your future. If you are hoping to rise among princes, you have to stand where princes stand. Therefore, here's your next step: replace your broke acquaintances with wealthy instructors. Think about the hierarchy of power in your life. The average man seeks approval from people beneath him since it's easier to be loved than to be corrected. The ambitious guy seeks advice from people who can sharpen his brain like a sharp blade. In the era of algorithms, your surroundings extend beyond your neighborhood. It's what you consume, who you surround yourself with, and whose language you begin to adopt. When I started shaping my new circle, I made a list, names of people who had already built the life I desired. Not famous people, not dreamers, strategists. In the Renaissance, goal-oriented men did the same. They learned under masters, learned their strategies, and gained not only their skills but also their mindset. The Medici taught merchants and artists both equally. They didn't just generate wealth, they established dynasties. Today, that same strategy applies. The wealthy people you admire have left behind a breadcrumb trail of psyche and system. Analyze it. Get obsessed over it. But Machiavelli gives a warning here: admiration without change is worship. Don't learn to become a fan, learn to become a rival. When I initially modeled my own mentors, I didn't see myself sitting beside them, I saw myself outperforming them. And this move from admiration to competition ignites your inner strategist, since when you consider the powerful not as gods but as men who just played the game longer, you stop being afraid and begin to learn like a predator hunting its prey. That was how I studied modern wealthy, not as idols, but as architects. How does Jeff Bezos think about time? How does Warren Buffett define patience? How does Elon Musk use debt as a tool for power? These are not just billionaires, they're modern princes, men who knew that fortune is not earned, it's generated. Each of them followed Machiavelli's principle that the intelligent man does at once what the dumb man does eventually. They act with speed and confidence while other people hesitate and ask permission. Now let's talk about time. The next pillar of your change is learning to consider time as a valuable asset. Machiavelli said a prince should never waste daylight waiting for the perfect opportunity, because idleness is the ally of destruction. Translate that into today's society: your mornings, nights, and weekends are not for relaxation but for preparation. The average guy burns hours browsing, watching, and waiting. The ruler in training studies, develops, and calculates. When I was still working a 9 to 5, I studied knowledge the way that many individuals consume entertainment: podcasts while driving, audiobooks in the gym, and notes scribbled at red lights. You have to transform your life into an institution of self-education. Every free time is either enhancing or diminishing your potential. But here's where the majority fail: they overwhelm their mind with information yet never create objectives. The ruler always governs for a certain conquest, not vague ambition. If your objective is to accumulate wealth, establish the realm in which you will rule. Is it business? Real estate? Investments? Every moment spent learning outside that field is a distraction disguised as productivity. Concentration creates momentum, momentum builds power, and power in any sector is currency. Still, learning from a distance can only take you so far. There comes a time when you must enter into the battleground, into the real place where power congregates. In Machiavelli's Florence, power was exchanged in private meetings, salons, and courts. Today it happens at conferences, mastermind gatherings, and places full of investors and creative people. These are your modern-day palaces. For access to them, you must pay an entry fee, not in flattery, but in commitment. And this takes you to your next step, the one that separates thinkers from doers. Because the route to success is not founded on hoarding but on deploying. You cannot accumulate wealth without first risking what you have. And although the people consider debt as danger, Machiavelli would call it a weapon, a measured gamble that encourages transformation. In his words, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more dangerous to execute, or more uncertain in its success than to take the initiative in the introduction of a new order of events. In the simplest terms, revolution, personal or financial, needs risk. The question is not whether you can afford it, but whether you can afford not to take action. And therefore, as you prepare to move into the next level, you'll come across that universal moment when your desire exceeds your budget, when opportunity knocks at your door but the price seems unbearable. That time will test your courage, your faith, and your future. How you respond will decide whether you continue to be a student of wealth or ultimately become its master.